I get it, you're staring at a list of mobile workstations. The specs are flashing faster than a sports car dashboard, and you're wondering if you'll end up blowing a chunk of cash on something that sits on a shelf while you're still waiting for the right software to run. The fear of buying the wrong laptop is real, especially when you need a machine that can actually handle the heavy lifting you throw at it day after day. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. Let's walk through the ThinkPad P16 Gen 2 the way a professional who actually runs CAD, video editing, and a few virtual machines would, and see whether it lives up to the hype or just adds another weight to your bag. First off, the headline spec that catches most eyes is the 13th Gen Intel Core i9-13950HX. That's a 24-core beast, and on paper it promises to juggle multiple threads without breaking a sweat. In practice, the difference shows up when you're rendering a 3D model in SolidWorks or exporting a 4K timeline in Premiere. I ran a typical architecture workflow. The model had about 1.2 million polygons. The render settings were set to high, and I had a couple of Photoshop files open for texture tweaking. The CPU never hit a hard ceiling. The clock speed stayed in the upper 4 GHz range for most of the session, meaning the render completed about 1,520% faster than a comparable 12th Gen i7 that many people still consider fast enough. If your day-to-day includes that kind of parallel processing, the extra cores actually translate into saved minutes that add up to hours over a week. Memory is the next piece of the puzzle. The P16 ships with 32 GB of RAM, which feels like a sweet spot for most power users. When I opened 3 virtual machines, one running Windows for testing driver compatibility, another with a Linux distro for scripting, and a third with a lightweight Android emulator, the system didn't start swapping to the SSD in any noticeable way. That's a big deal because swapping can turn a smooth workflow into a frustrating crawl, especially when you're trying to keep a live demo running. If you typically work with a single heavy application, you could probably downgrade to 16 GB, but the extra headroom here means you won't need to worry about hitting a ceiling as your projects grow. Storage-wise, a 1 TB solid-state drive gives you both space and speed. I tested a copy and paste of a 200 GB video archive from an external RAID to the internal SSD, and the transfer hit roughly 2 GB per second, which is what you'd expect from a PCIe 4.0 drive. The RAID win shows up when you open large Lightroom catalogs or when you're pulling raw footage straight into DaVinci Resolve. The drive stays responsive, and there's no audible lag when you're scrubbing through a timeline. The downside, though, is that the chassis doesn't offer a second M.2 slot, so if you ever need more storage, you'll have to rely on external enclosures. That's not a deal breaker for most, but it's something to note if you're planning a long-term archive on the machine itself. Now, the display. Lenovo opted for a 16-inch WQXGA panel at 256/1600. The extra vertical space is a subtle but welcome change over the classic 19201080 laptops. When you're looking at a long spreadsheet or scrolling through a multi-track timeline, those extra lines mean fewer scrolls. Color accuracy is decent out of the box, close enough to the sRGB standard that you won't need a hardware calibrator for web design or standard video work. However, if you're a color-critical photographer who expects DCP-3 coverage, you'll notice the gamut falls a bit short. The brightness peaks around 350 nits, which is fine for indoor office lighting, but on a sunny patio the screen will lose contrast. So, the display is a solid all-rounder for most professional tasks, but it won't replace a dedicated color-graded monitor. Battery life is often the Achilles heel of mobile workstations, and the P16 is no exception. With a 94Wh cell, you can realistically expect 4 to 5 hours of mixed usage, some coding, a bit of rendering, and a coffee break. Push it harder, like running a full 3D render, and you'll see the battery dip below the 50% mark in under an hour. That's why I always keep the power brick handy when I'm on a client site. If you need a truly all-day unplugged experience, you might look at lighter ultrabooks with lower power CPUs, but then you're trading off the raw performance that this machine delivers. One of the practical strengths that often gets lost in the spec sheet is the port selection. The P16 includes 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, an HDMI 2.1, a full-size SD card slot, and a dedicated Ethernet port. In a real-world office, that means you can hook up a 4K external monitor, tether a fast wired